25 species of wild bees have become extinct over the past 150 years in the UK. That's almost 10% of all of our bees. How? Why? Well, new research provides the most conclusive evidence to date that the finger should be pointed at the lucrative bee farming industry as a major contributor to the decline in wild bees. The farms rely financially on the sale of honey, and the more they sell, the better off they are. This new research provides further evidence suggesting that the intensive practice is spreading disease among wild bees, and experts are calling for farmers to do more. Flynn's bee farm is deep in the heart of Kent. There are just over 100 beehives here. Seems like a lot? Well, actually this is just a small farm, with some having near 800 hives across the UK.
We're mostly known for our propolis, which is a resin that the bees gather from the buds of trees that they chew to mix with their own special enzymes, and then they use it as a disinfectant within the hive. But in addition to the propolis products that we make, we also produce 9 different blends of honey. Actually it might be 10 now, because we've just produced a chocolate honey. And we also do all these skin creams and toiletries, which are made from beeswax, honey, and none of them are made with any harsh chemicals.
A bee farm generates its product in 3 main steps. It goes from here to here, and then to here. Now, there are over 2,000 bee farms across the UK, just like this one at Flynn's, and each colony can produce up to 32 pounds of honey. Now, considering that some of the farms have more than 800 colonies, you're looking at about 25,000 pounds of honey per farm. It's perfect, right? Well, latest research coming out of the Penryn campus at the University of Exeter in January suggests that wild bees are paying the price for the commercial industry. Dr. Lena Wilfer worked with an expert team on the biggest study of bee pathogen transferal to date, and she thinks bee farming is to blame because when the bees are brought in from abroad, they spread any diseases they may be carrying to the wild bees.
Over the last years, it's become increasingly clear that many of these pathogens, and especially viruses, are multi-host pathogens, so they don't just infect one species but multiple species. So when we think about honeybees and also commercial bumblebees, I would say that a big concern around that is pathogens, especially with the honeybees, the varroa mite, which unfortunately people now just have to control.
The varroa mite is the biggest concern to beekeepers. Arriving from Australia in 1992, it's since killed millions of bees and spreads easily. It transmits viruses in the bee colonies and even increases birth defects in the hive. It then only takes 2 years for the colony to die out. That's more than 50,000 bees. Research at the Royal Holloway University is being carried out to try to help bee farmers identify and treat some of the diseases. The first step is observation. Are there any red or white spots on the bees? Next is the bizarre process of using everyday icing sugar. Once it's been thrown onto the hive, the bees clean each other rapidly, getting rid of any unwanted mites in the process. The bees are almost clean in just 2 minutes. Finally, the guys at Royal Holloway look into the chemical properties of the pollen to see if the varroa mite could thrive in that particular hive. But this is just one part of their investigations.
The most recent work we've been doing has been looking at what are known as emerging infectious diseases, and so Ebola is a very good example of an emerging infectious disease. It hops from one species to another and then goes epidemic. And these kinds of disease are not limited to humans. In honeybees, emerging infectious diseases, which include both a parasitic blood-sucking mite and the viruses that it transmits, have been really important in honeybee decline, and the work that we've been doing shows that those viruses actually are also potentially emerging in wild bumblebees.
The university also has labs to analyse the effects of parasites on the behaviour of bumblebees. They're segregated into small containers to encourage growth of new colonies, which can then be used as a source for parasite cell experimentation. Some bumblebees are already being investigated to help the research, and they're each given unique numbers to track their development. They're collected individually by tweezers and are trapped by this syringe. They're then glued, and their unique number is stuck on.
Largely, the problems that we have with managed honeybees are problems of disease, and they wiped out most of the wild populations of the European or Western honeybee, and it's only because honeybees are managed by people who look after them that we still have honeybees, really.
However, many of the bee farmers disagree with the researchers, as they believe they're carrying out their practices in a sustainable way.
I would say that they have probably seen the programmes that have been recorded in America, where they treat their bees very differently to how we treat them here. A British bee farmer is somebody, technically, who's got more than 40 hives. In America, you're talking thousands, and they pile them onto great big trucks where the bees are shut in without any air or water for several hours, while they drive the bees on lorries from state to state.
The British Beekeeping Association helps the farmers with the conservation of bees, and they think there isn't a problem with disease as long as the practice is done correctly.
Because of the numbers of hives that bee farmers have to look after, they have to change their approach, and you cannot spend all day going through a colony, looking at it in every detail, and so on and so forth. You have to be much more pragmatic in your approach. But bee farmers have to treat their stocks very much as livestock, and that will influence the approach. But as I say, one of the major factors is simply the numbers.
So what can the government do to help stop the spread of disease? I came down to BugLife, a conservation charity for invertebrates, to find out. It was here that I stumbled across the campaigns officer Vanessa sampling for insects. She thinks we need better restrictions for the importation of bees to stop disease spreading into the UK, like the hive beetle.
So the hive beetle is a pest that's come from, I think it's Asia, and it's sort of slowly moving upwards, and they've now found it in Italy. So there are we're trying to get some better restrictions put into place to try and stop people from importing honeybees from Italy, because there's the whole issue about bringing in the small hive beetle, which is a really, really horrible pest.
3/4 of all imported bees had diseases last year, so we clearly need stricter rules. But what can we do as individuals? Is there any way we can help at all?
The public can do a lot of things for bees in their own garden. One of the biggest things is plant more native wildflowers and things that encourage bees. So things like herbs are great for bees. Also things that flower later in the year and earlier in the year.
You can simply contribute to a charity such as the British Beekeepers Association. We have a fund called the Friends of the Honeybee, where it's just paying in, you learn about bees, you're informed, but basically you're helping us to deliver our charitable aims.
The other thing is they also need places to nest. So bumblebees, for example, many of them are ground nesting, so they nest in things like old mouse holes. So having those sorts of resources available is one big important thing.
There have been suggestions of a doomsday scenario in which all of the UK bees become extinct. Whilst not everyone agrees, experts do agree that it's an important scenario that we have to consider.
Now, I don't think bees are going to die out, but I think what we should be worried about is the fact that bee populations are declining, and they're declining globally. And so we're not going to enter this doomsday scenario, but we are potentially entering a scenario where pollination services go down, yield of particular crops goes down, food prices potentially go up for specific crops that are important to our health.